do you think of when you think of the word hijab?
Misunderstood.
Emancipation.
Choice.
A religious tradition.
A symbol of oppression.
There's loads of interpretations for it.
For some, the hijab may be a symbol of faith, a form of political dissent, or the physical embodiment of their culture. For others, it is an abject display of an ancient, deeply ingrained form of sexism, that which reduces women to the honor of their bodies.
To make the choice to be able to present yourself that way, I think is courageous, especially in today's society, in the Western world.
My hair was like a hostage in the hands of Iranian government.
While some countries are fighting to lift mandatory hijab, others are attempting to ban it altogether. So why does a hijab invoke such strong and opposing views? It's hard not to notice that despite the dire need for a nuanced discussion, many prefer to end it before it begins. The hijab is often dismissed as simply a piece of cloth, a form of self-expression.
Because in the end of the day, this is just a piece of cloth.
This piece of cloth.
I wish people would just look at it the way it is. It's a piece of cloth on my head.
But is that really the case? According to the Quran and the Hadith, Muslim women must guard their modesty and not draw attention to their bodies. Modesty is how a Muslim woman shows her adherence to God and maintains her honor and dignity in the eyes of society. Although there may be dozens of ways of interpreting the hijab in our complex society, in Islamic scripture it means one thing: the preservation of female modesty.
It's a sign of modesty.
Kind of promote modesty.
Symbol of modesty.
Modesty is a really big part of our religion.
That it represents modesty.
In the religious point of view, modesty is key to one's moral worth, especially for women. Sexual relations between unmarried men and women is a grave sin. Women are required to cover up their bodies so not to entice men into sin. In fact, observing hijab isn't just about hair or face covering. Hijab is about covering all parts of the female body that may arouse a male. This is what we recognize in other contexts as modesty culture.
Dressing modestly is one of the ways that we as Christian girls can honor God with our body.
Sometimes, the conception of women is tied to the shamefulness of their body, literally by definition. For example, the Arabic word awra means private parts, nudity, or genitals, essentially referring to the parts of the body which must be covered. In some languages, like Urdu, over time the word awra evolved to aurat, meaning simply a woman. It is hard not to note that while both men and women have modesty requirements, it is only for women that this idea becomes literally all-encompassing. She is a shameful thing to be covered. Meanwhile, in the West, it has become more common to understand female modesty not just as a personal value, but as an excuse too often used to blame victims of sexual assault and harassment. Savvy advocates of the modesty might say that, in fact, modesty is the solution to a culture obsessed with physical superficiality.
And a symbol of a woman's intellectual ability over her physical beauty and, and sexuality.
The point of my hijab is to liberate me from society's ludicrous expectations and objectification of what women could and should look like.
A woman chooses to hide her body, therefore putting up a clear message that she wishes to be judged by her mind, not her body.
Because oppression means the taking away of someone's power,
yes.
Right? And what hijab does is it basically privatizes women's sexuality. That's essentially what it does. So what are we saying when we say that by taking away or privatizing a woman's sexuality, we're oppressing her? What does that mean? What is that saying about the source of a woman's power?
We're saying that a woman is only strong if she's sexy in public?
Yeah!
Did I get it?
That does, on the face of it, make a lot of sense. But let's unpack it a little. Of course, women should dress in a way that makes them comfortable, and that includes modest dress. As a matter of personal comfort, modesty is as valid a choice as any other. But when it is an ideological statement, that modesty becomes harmful. If a modest woman claims she covers because she wants to be respected for her mind, not judged for her body, it gives credence to the idea that a woman who is less modest does wish to be objectified, to be judged sexually.
A woman that doesn't wear the hijab is most likely to get sexual assault and abuse than a woman that does wear it because she covers up.
Either a woman's dress is a relevant consideration in how much respect we give to her mind, or it isn't. The modest woman might even be right that people do judge her on her dress, and that covering might earn her more respect. We are living in the real world, and that means navigating real-world circumstances. But even then, for modesty to be a feminist choice, it must be explicitly acknowledged that it is an acquiescence to an inherently anti-feminist point of view, one that feminists should be fighting to dismantle, not wearing as a badge of honor. There's also the reality that such thinking spirals into fewer and fewer dignities for women over time. When one woman covers, she may seem safer from the male sexualization and all that entails than the woman next to her who does not cover. But that safety is relative. When all women cover, when modesty becomes an arms race for self-respect, suddenly ever more minute aspects of female appearance and even movement become sexualized. And this is how you get to a society where a woman's laughter is deemed too provocative and erotic. These are the societies where gender segregation becomes the norm, until eventually women vanish from the public sphere altogether. But wait, despite all this, hijabi women, particularly in the West, are telling us that they are not in danger of disappearing. They are not oppressed.
I mean, do I look oppressed to you? I don't know.
And they don't just communicate this through their words. It is easy to find video after video of a young, cool hijabi showing us that she is not oppressed. Far from the uniform black hijab, her makeup, her clothes, her overall styling, even her manner of speaking, all scream, "Look at me," and think, do I look oppressed to you? Someone like me, with what appears to be an abundant freedom and autonomy, is choosing this. So how can the hijab be coercive?
So even if you hate it, I still wrap my hijab.
So let's examine in detail the idea of choice.
Not only think it's brave, but it's a conscientious choice, a personal preference.
There's this Western stereotype that a Muslim woman who wears it did not have the choice to do so.
It has been a choice since pretty much the beginning of Islam.
Few will argue that the legally enforced hijab of Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, or Iran are garments of empowerment.
18,000 of women were sent to the court. Why? Because they were not fully covering their hair.
But these are often dismissed as edge cases, extremist, fundamentalist interpretations of Islamic tradition.
Like, we keep saying that as Muslims, we keep saying the hijab is the choice.
But if the burqa of Afghanistan is an edge case, so are the skateboarding hip fashionistas of the West. In fact, one might argue that the hijabis displayed so reverently in our media are far less representative of the average woman who covers by sheer numbers alone. For 1 in 10 Muslims, the headscarf is mandated by law. That is to say, an estimate of over 80 million women living under enforced hijab. In others, a vast majority believe that a woman must cover. Still, the hip and empowered hijabis are centered and highlighted in Western media, granted huge platforms in order to shatter harmful stereotypes. But what happens when the focus on shattering stereotypes becomes providing cover for deeply entrenched sexism? When the media places a disproportionate focus on women who are, by their own admission, perfectly autonomous and free, and define the hijab by these selective experiences, they enable the most powerful, most free women the ability to obscure the oppression of their less privileged sisters. By claiming that an oppressive hijab is merely a stereotype, they are misrepresenting or even erasing the reality of the women who are not free to make their own choices, not equal, not empowered. Let's go back to the religious pressure to cover. While some Muslim women disagree whether hair covering is mandated or not, or whether the face must be covered, disagreement in a religious sense is about the degree of modesty. As to whether a woman must be modest to be moral, the answer to that is a resounding yes.
When you say compulsory,
yes.
Who's making it compulsory?
Well, in our belief, we're taught that it's fard, which means compulsory to wear the headscarf.
They have made it so that to be a good Muslim woman, you must wear the headscarf.
Compounding the pressure from religion alone is the reality that in highly religious communities, religious pressure is social pressure. And we know that social pressure is powerful. In the Western world, the pressures to be sexy and conforming to a certain body are powerful, and this reality is addressed and objected to by Western feminists, and for good reason. The social reality in Muslim communities is no different. The hijabi woman is displayed to women and girls as the pinnacle of feminine virtue, while a woman who does not cover is a woman who debases herself for leering men. In this climate, it's dishonest to call the hijab, even in a free country, a free choice. If one option wins you praise from your community and the other contempt, stigma, ostracization, or outright violence, are you equally free to choose? What happens if she chooses to take it off? Lastly, the choice discussion often glosses over one tricky reality. Women can choose to be misogynists, to be subordinate, and to support male rule and dominance in a society. Even a perfectly free choice is not a feminist choice simply because a woman chooses it. But sometimes the hijab is not about choice or even feminism. Sometimes it represents political dissent or solidarity with the marginalized community. Let's take a closer look at the hijab in politics. We've discussed how the hijab has a religious meaning of modesty and explored the role of choice. And if these were the only issues at play, this discussion would be far less complicated. But the truth is, it doesn't take much exploration at all to see how the hijab is a sexist garment in a religious sense, and how it fails to be a real choice. Still, many in the West, particularly progressives and liberals, are unsure about how to approach this issue. Their confusion comes not from historical or religious context, but from political realities, most of which have nothing to do with the hijab itself. The most important of these political realities is the fact that Muslims are a minority in the West, and in some countries, unpopular minorities who may be subject to hostility and abuse. The hijab is a clear, visual manifestation of Islam. Unfortunately, this means that those who are bigoted against Muslims find hijabis an easy target for abuse or exclusion.
Because it's no longer safe to walk on the streets with a headscarf on.
Consequently, those who wish to counter discrimination against Muslims may feel that the hijab is an appropriate symbol of this quest for tolerance.
Participating in this event because I think it's important to show that I, as a woman who I am not Muslim, but I stand with my Muslim sisters.
Routinely, we see feminist leaders in the West, often in positions of power, wearing the hijab out of respect for Muslims' values. Some activists host Wear a Hijab Day on campuses or other public places, attempting to build understanding and tolerance of Muslims by asking non-Muslims to try on the hijab. But what most Western commentators miss is that the hijab isn't just a physical manifestation of Islam. It is a physical manifestation of conservative Islam. Most Muslim women don't wear it unless they're in a country where it is forced by law. But increasingly, their religiosity is defined by it, both by conservative imams and by Western society. In this way, well-meaning Westerners end up contributing to a stereotype of Muslims, boxing them into a role of religious conservatism. Whatever their intention, this approach racializes the hijab and accepts degrading practices as simply a different way of living.
When I wasn't wearing hijab, I was just some ordinary white girl from New York City.
Placing such a strong emphasis on the practice to Islamic identity as a whole increases the pressure on Muslim women to wear it.
And I decided to reclaim that identity by putting this scarf on my head, and it's sort of a symbol of my defiance of Islamophobia.
This is especially frustrating to ex-Muslims because there are ways of showing support and love to the Muslim community without paying a homage to a practice that is oppressing countless women. For example, Muslims pay what is called zakat every year. It's a certain percentage of their income that they're religiously instructed to send to the poor and needy. Zakat, both in intention and execution, is relatively harmless and indeed a practice worthy of popular praise. Rather than wear a controversial garment that even Muslim women object to in order to show solidarity, why not have zakat drives to raise money for Muslim communities in need? The reason you don't see zakat drives, but you do see hijabs for solidarity, is because the former requires a true understanding of the faith, of the complexity of the issues at hand, and of a willingness to parse through them without compromising on one's principles. This is much easier said than done. But in order for our political activism to be meaningful, it has to survive critical examination. Otherwise, we might just be succeeding only in making ourselves feel better, but aiding in the oppressions of others. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what does it mean to be tolerant? Can we be accepting of people who think and believe differently than us without perpetuating the harm that those different thoughts and beliefs might be causing? Can we support a religious minority in the West without supporting all of their beliefs? Can we stand against anti-Muslim bigotry while supporting those fighting against harm at the hands of Muslims? Of course we can, and we must.